Howdy. Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to yet another Building Equitable Economies webinar from California Forward. Today, we're going to be focusing on improving justice system interventions. Next slide, Lauren. Okay, so this webinar is being recorded. This is for the panelists, but make sure to keep your mics muted when you're not speaking. You will be providing questions in the question and answer panel, which should be on the right side of your screen. My colleague David Luisa, who will be running the Q&A, will be pulling those questions out of the Q&A and asking the different panelists. So we'll get through the presentations, and then we should have a really good amount of time for Q&A. So please do submit those questions ahead of time so that we can prepare for that part of the discussion. All right, next slide, Lauren. Great. So today we're going to be focusing on justice system interventions, which is a bit of a tongue twister, I guess. And we're so glad that you could join us. You might be wondering, why is California Forward delving into the criminal justice system? And as a statewide organization with a mission to make sure that the economy and government work for everyone, this is a very important priority for us. Not only because it's a situation that we need to make sure that our justice system is just, but it also really impacts the public resources that are available for all sorts of other supports for people in the different regions of the state. And we're not new to this work, it turns out. We've been doing this for about a decade. In response to the California Public Safety Realignment Act of 2011, we launched our Justice System Change Initiative to help California counties transform their criminal justice systems through data-driven practices. And before I introduce the speakers, I really want to acknowledge the terrific work of my colleague Nadine Ono, who's been documenting this work during the entire time, as well as Jim Mayer, the former CEO of the organization, who had this as a major priority for his own work. So today we'll be learning more about the findings from our criminal justice reform studies conducted in 4 counties throughout the state. And I hope that this is really an important contribution to what can sometimes be a polarized dialogue around what we should do about criminal justice reform. Here we hope that we are providing really practical, really just and innovative solutions for people that are going to address the range of concerns that people have across the political spectrum when these issues come up. So in order to make these presentations, I'm very pleased to introduce the folks that have been our partners in this. Scott McDonald, retired probation chief and criminal justice consultant, and Kevin O'Connell, data and research consultant who led this work. They're going to be talking a little bit about the work, and then we'll be turning it over to Under Sheriff Shannon Dykes and Jerry Gutierrez, executive officer of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, on how the data from these studies is being used very practically on the ground. So with no further ado, Scott and Kevin, take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, folks. I'm just on audio today. So I thought I'd quickly give a little bit of context, a little more context to this, and then we'll turn to Kevin, my colleague, who will go into the data a bit. So just by way of context, at the time that I began working with Cal Forward on this, it was on the tail end of a 30-year career in probation. And for much of that time, what we really saw in the field was a tremendous growth of jails throughout the nation. And so what you see is a sort of a linear pattern of continued growth. Jails would get full, and then they'd build more jails. And around this time also, we had just begun to implement AB 109, prison realignment, which added significant more pressure and population to the jails. So the challenges were very great and pressures were very great at the local level when we began this work. And there also, I would say, was sort of a lack of cross-system, cross-discipline work to address the issues that plague the jails. And one thing we say about that is that when all else fails, jails become sort of the receptacle for handling the social problems that we wrestle with across systems. And so what we really were attempting to do is create, partner with counties to create a process where we endeavored to create system change in a positive way. And to do this, it would require a governance structure and partnership across county disciplines, behavioral health, the sheriff, probation, but it would also require data. And so we focused on the jail studies because the jails, as I said, being that place where when all else fails, people end up in jail, it became a place where we could really capture some data that would be telling to counties about what the opportunities were. Around the same time that we were beginning this work, the Affordable Care Act had just been implemented or was beginning to be implemented. And that also created some new opportunities and ways of thinking about how to serve people who end up in jail. So with that, maybe we can just go to the next slide. And actually the next slide, this next slide after that. One more. So, you know, as I sort of noted, the fact of the matter is that jails are very good at keeping track of who gets in and who gets out on an individual basis, but jails tend to lack data about their system that sort of captures the system in aggregate terms. And by looking at jail data in aggregate terms, you could go back one slide. I'm sorry, I had you move too forward. We can often illuminate things that sort of surprise us or capture things that we didn't know about the data. And San Bernardino our colleagues from San Bernardino can speak to that later. The other thing is jail studies often really illuminate inequities that exist among vulnerable populations and people of color. And the other thing is that by having good data, not only can you illuminate these problems, but that good data can lead to better choices and better outcomes, policy decisions, and practices that help address things. So with that, I think I'll turn to Kevin, who, you know, these reports, we did 5 of them in 5 counties, and they're pretty massive. They're, you know, 86 pages long, and they contain a lot of data. So there's no way in a short call like this that we would be able to capture all of it. So we basically picked a few data points that Kevin will share.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. And I think, you know, across 5 counties, you know, you really do kind of see that the differences across both in practices and just, you know, the data itself kind of helps to kind of better understand, get really specific. Because, you know, these are all independent counties with independent actors, multiple agencies, and how do we kind of paint the picture of, you know, the size of the challenge, the size and different perspectives, and make sure it kind of becomes a collaborative effort to kind of look at the jail as a shared resource and really understand who's in there and why and who keeps coming back. Because then you can kind of get to things like, you know, policy changes, treatment options, programming, once you kind of know who these folks are and kind of what those needs are. And so I'm going to show you a couple of kind of comparative slides across a couple of the counties we work with, in a way just to kind of illustrate how different, you know, same information, you know, similar approach can lead to kind of some very different information from different counties. And this is the way to kind of frame some of the work we've done. But next slide, please. And so one of the things I think about, you know, about jails is like there's the number of people who get booked in a given year is one number. And I think that sometimes that's folks coming through the front door. What we oftentimes though find out is that a lot of these folks leave fairly quickly. And so even though the daily population of a jail is going to be one number, that's very different from who actually comes through the front door. And that's a really important consideration. And so what this slide shows is across the 4 counties we kind of had the data for to kind of show this is very different amounts of who actually stays what we call 3 days or less. And the reason I make that 3-day determination is that that's kind of usually most arraignments or those first court cases will happen. What this shows is across 4 counties, very different rates of who gets out really quickly. And so, I think in San Bernardino, we can talk a little bit about the interpretation of that, but in Santa Cruz County, 75% of people booked in are out within 3 days. So that gets to that one, probably the nature of the crimes being committed or booked in on, but also some very different practices. And I think, San Bernardino, 66% get out within 3 days, Merced, 54%, Riverside, 45%. But the really story there is that who gets booked in is very different from who stays. And that's a really important part of this, is that a lot of those determinations are made very early on about who stays. And so who actually is going to be in there over a longer time period is very different. And then that kind of gets to then how those jail beds get used and who is really being treated and served while they're in custody is very different from who actually gets to the front door. And a lot of those short stays, I would call them, really around things like drug and arrest bookings, alcohol, things that end up being kind of more about kind of public health issues, and usually leave fairly quickly. This is from a couple of years ago, so I think COVID is a whole different area, and I think maybe I can have Shannon and Jerry kind of talk a little about kind of how COVID has impacted their operations, but that's really changed too about how folks are getting in and how quickly they're actually leaving these facilities. But a big misconception is just because people booked in doesn't mean they stay very long, and that's a really important consideration about how that flow of people really looks. Next slide, please. And also, as we kind of looked at this, we also looked at then, like, for the reasons they're getting in, a lot of jails are made up of both the people committing, new, what's called fresh crimes. And so that's an instance where someone actually saw on the street a crime happen, they get arrested, they get booked into jail. But a significant number of folks also get booked in for things that aren't necessarily about a new crime, but about maybe past behavior or past, or not complying with past rules of the court. An example there would be technical probation violations, where someone's being booked in for maybe not showing up for office visits, not complying with officers, like drug testing, but also things like warrants, where people are missing court dates and actually going out to warrant. Those can cause them to get booked back into jail again. And so we look at actually who stays and actually who makes up that daily population. And in places like Riverside, Merced, San Bernardino, roughly about 45% are actually made up of folks coming in for things that aren't those new, fresh crimes, but actually things about kind of old business. Again, things like warrants and kind of probation violations don't involve new crimes. And the difference there oftentimes is, a range of things, but the idea is that each county is a little bit different about who's actually staying in their population, and the policy options are always very different as well. So the idea here is that we can kind of unpack kind of who's actually in the jail. You actually can better understand how other partners are involved and how to really connect across agencies, not just to look at it as the jail population is one homogeneous group, but a lot of different kind of areas and opportunities to have discussions and make sure there's a collaborative discussion about the use of jail. Next slide, please. And then I think the other part we looked at, and I think, the return to jail is oftentimes a big topic. I don't call this recidivism because it's a little bit different in kind of how we think about it, but really this is people that come back to jail. And so each one of these counties we looked over the course of 4 years, what we're seeing across these 3 ones that we have some information on for over 4 years is that 43% of people they were booked in, I think, in most of these counties in like 2015 or 16, came back over a 4-year period. So in Riverside County, about 45% came back over 4 years. In San Bernardino, about 57%. And in Santa Cruz, about 72%. So what that says is you're actually having a lot of jail impact, and just like basically a lot of the bed days being used are people that have been there before. And that's a big concern, I think, for a lot of people who operate jails, to make sure that you are getting people reentered in society and to having those warm handoffs to folks that do come back often, but making sure there really is a way to desist and deter people from coming back and basically being crime-free. And a lot of what this says is that even the people that come back in these facilities, again, are often very different as well. But the idea here is that each county tells a different story, and actually unpacking those options with each county is really kind of where the heart of this project was, is really kind of making sure we could actually have localized conversations about it to really understand why there's differences here, not just there is a difference. And so the point of this slide is not to say that Santa Cruz has a higher, jail recurrence rate. It could be the nature of the people that come back in, because a lot of the folks in Santa Cruz are actually coming back for alcohol-related crimes or disorderly conduct, which stay a handful of days, versus other things we might think we think of coming back and being justice involved. But the idea here is to really unpack this and really kind of demystify a topic like, like recidivism, or like people coming back into facilities again. Next slide, please.
So I'll take this real quick. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the jail studies have a way of illuminating what happens to vulnerable population. And that includes people with health issues, mental health issues, and people of color. So this is a slide from Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz has long taken an intentional and deliberate focus on the overrepresentation of people of color in the system, particularly in the juvenile side. And what this slide shows is to the far left is the column shows the general county population. And you can see at the bottom of that, there's a very thin sliver of blue. That's African American populations are slightly less than 1%, about 1% of the general county population. Hispanic, Latinx are 29%. And what this chart shows is that at every decision point subsequent to that, from arrest to who gets arrested, who gets booked in jail, who's held 4 days or more, who's held through the adjudication process until sentencing, and who is released to prison, who actually gets a prison commitment, you can see that people of color, Latinx and Black individuals, their representation goes up more significantly at each stage in the process. This comports with national data when we've looked at this issue. And you can see conversely that the white population, their representation actually goes down as compared to their representation in the county population at each subsequent stage. So this is just a high level data point that can then be used to sort of ask questions and dig into this data to look at what are some of the factors that create disproportionality to this extent. So I'll turn back to Kevin.
Next slide, please. And I think the last two, and I think I wanted to, and this actually was where a lot of our partnership with San Bernardino and Riverside really I think was really helpful, and I think really amazing to kind of see the work they were doing in their facilities and in their community to really kind of impact of the seriously mentally ill in their facilities. And really what we kind of showed was, what we kind of found was the jail studies that people with serious mental illnesses they returned to jail more frequently, they stayed longer based on the seriousness of their crime. And I think really that kind of leads to a disproportionality in the types of people coming back for really kind of behavioral health needs. But a lot of times the seriousness of their crimes were also things to take into consideration. So the public safety issue along with that public health need. And I think both San Bernardino and Riverside really kind of worked to really kind of better understand and really kind of jump into how do we really serve this population better, create those community linkages, partner with like probation, partner with behavioral health to make sure these needs are met. So jail isn't the place where they end up. Actually, there's a lot of other things in the community, but also to really improve what they offered in the facilities as well. And all three counties we looked at, they really looked at delving into kind of what got people there who were seriously mentally ill, what are some of those circumstances, what are those booking reasons, but also ways to really enhance that reentry process and discharge planning. And so on the next slide, if you can just the next slide. What we do see is we just see differences. And I think what this kind of led us to is to say, we see that people who are on kind of mental health units or being served through mental health services, they got booked in more in a given year than the average general population person. So what this shows is about 3 times per year, someone with a mental health need gets booked in per year versus about 1.5 for the general population. And what that tells us is they're coming in more often, most likely. And this doesn't really control for the seriousness of the crime and a little bit of each person's history. What they do here is you're seeing more chronicity with people that have mental health needs, and that's not surprising. They're out there in the community. They may not, housing might be an issue. Continuity of care might be an issue. But what they see is they're coming back into the facilities more often. And that chronicity then leads to, again, possible decompensation, breaking the treatment process, and then having to kind of restart that reentry process all over again. But the idea here is how do we make sure once people get out, they get connected to services, they stay connected, and they stay on their plan to be healthy and happy in the community. Next slide, please. And then kind of to get the disparity around like similar levels of crime, and then length of stay is we kind of see for felonies that the average general population person was staying about 55 days for people that stayed past that 4-day mark. And the reason we kind of do that is because folks that stay a little bit longer, we can kind of compare them a little bit differently. They're not getting out so fast. What we kind of saw was about 55 days on average for the average length of stay for the general population for a felony, but about 130 average length of stay for people with some kind of a mental health status or serious mental illness. And that can be, we look at that a number of different ways. So it's really to understand why that's happening. What are some of those differences? What are some of the challenges operationally? And then what does that look like to either find ways to reduce that length of stay or to better understand why that's happening from a treatment level or a release level. And on the right there is then for the same thing for misdemeanors. About the average day is about 5 days for a misdemeanor, about 13 days for people with a mental health need. And so again, these are just differences we kind of tried to work with the county to then kind of better understand. And that was a way to then have that conversation about what is done, what more could be done, how do you work with your partners outside, but also work with your partners inside to make sure the best services are available, and also make sure there's that good reentry and continuity of care. Next slide, please. But now I want to introduce our partners from San Bernardino County. And actually, so Shannon Dykes is the undersheriff for San Bernardino County, was a great partner as we were kind of working to start this up. I think really embraced kind of the idea that how do we better understand who's in the jail to then make sure we have those connections with other partners in the community as well as inside to really kind of use this data to understand and then use data to better manage and direct and really develop a strategy for engaging about who's in the jail and why and make sure the resources are in the right place. As well as Jerry Gutierrez, who's the executive officer of the jail currently in San Bernardino County, and also is a great partner of ours in Riverside County as well. So I kind of asked Jerry to do double duty here, both to kind of reflect a little bit about the work in Riverside, but also his current work in developing services and programs in San Bernardino as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to Shannon and to Jerry to take it from there.
Thank you, Kevin. What I'd like to do is give the audience just an overview about where we were at when we engaged in our relationship with California Forward. And frankly, that relationship was, at the time I was a brand new jail chief and I didn't know what I didn't know. And I found out that I needed California Forward more than they really needed me. And to kind of put these things in context, at the time prison realignment had just occurred. We were trying to analyze how we're affecting recidivism with our programming inside the jails and what does that really look like. Fortunately, I worked with a forward-thinking sheriff who wanted to do something to positively affect recidivism, and we were thinking about doing a program similar to sheriff's parole, basically putting ankle monitors on some of these folks, releasing them and monitoring them in programs, not just inside the facility, but certainly when they get released, and essentially having that hook, if you will, to be able to bring them back into custody if they aren't performing in some of those programs. And one of the things we were seeing at this time was a lot of things as a result of realignment. Prop 47 came out. You know, it's just like dieting. All of us as human beings need that hook that makes us do proper behaviors. When the doctor says your blood pressure is high, you need to go out and run and exercise and eat right. Well, it's the same thing in similar environments within the jail system. And so the need for data was really born out of this idea of sheriff's parole, because we didn't know what we didn't know. So we figured out at that initial presentation with California Forward that it would be much better to do a jail utilization study so we would know where we can actually launch from. And to give you an idea of our size, we have about a little over a 7,000 bed capacity. We book between 82 and 83,000 people a year. And when Kevin mentioned those people stay for a short period of time, depending on the year, what that looks like for us is between 26 and 29,000 folks actually only stay with us longer than 3 days. So the vast majority of people getting booked in our jails are being released. And when you think about that, that may be with or without any treatment, with or without any exposure to anything. They're just simply released back in the community. So I think there's a direct correlation that you're probably going to see them again, because we aren't necessarily having them long enough to maybe diagnose some of the issues and problems that we're moving forward with. So Kevin touched a lot on vulnerable populations, and in our study particularly, mental health really rang clear as far as Kevin showed you the statistics. Spending 2 times the time in jail on some of the lesser crimes or comparative crimes that the general population was, pointed out just a number of those things. One key thing when it talks about internal programming, we realized that a lot of the folks that could benefit from programming more than anybody else weren't even staying longer than 30 days. So in that piece, they may start a GED program, for instance, and not even be able to follow through with the GED program because they're getting released back out into the streets and no way to do that. So we made a number of adjustments on this. And at the time, we worked with California Forward on the study, and they showed us, hey, the folks that have mental health issues are staying in so long. We were also involved in the return to competency program with the state of California. And we really took a good hard look at those numbers, and using a contractor, we were able to take those folks that would normally wait an entire year to return them to competency and get them to the point where they could actually appear in court and understand what was happening to them. The ROC program would turn these folks around in what we found about 58 days. And out of the least complicated folks that had mental health problems, we called that more of the lower hanging fruit. We could turn them around in a much quicker time rather than waiting for the state hospitals to take them. Since we implemented that program, we've now expanded into what we call the jail-based competency program. And we actually work with other counties throughout the state using that same model. So we don't impact the state hospitals as much. We return these people to competency. And overall, we've lowered the amount of time they spend with us in the jail and prevent them from decompensating during that entire period of time where really they're not receiving any treatment. So there's just a number of things that the study pointed out to us. And I know I'm going to transfer to Jerry here in a minute to talk about how it works. But one of the key things that happened really was relationship based. Prison realignment as a whole, when you talk about law and justice organizations in any county, we really exist to be checks and balances for each other. So that's more of an adversarial kind of relationship if you really look at it on its face in the way our criminal justice system is designed. What realignment in California Forward showed us is that even though the checks and balances always need to exist, we also need to share resources. And we realized we were short partners. So in our law and justice group in San Bernardino County, and I'm talking about people that come to the table, decision makers, and that's department heads or assistant department heads. We include behavioral health and public health who have a seat at the table with the normal law and justice partners being the DA, probation, the court system and such. So bringing them to the table, we realized that mental health care, transferring folks out with any type of prior planning before their release wasn't occurring. So when I mentioned that contractor earlier, we also partnered with our own Department of Behavioral Health to do that planning. And because they know where all of their resources are, that's not something we would know. We would traditionally release those people. And after doing the California Forward study, now we're all able to monitor and do checks and balances and partner in ways we've never done before. The public defender and DA immediately came up with a rapid response team as a result of the California Forward study, where the Department of Behavioral Health is saying, hey, we've got these programs. The DA and public defender would say, hey, this program exists in San Bernardino County. We have a low-level offender. Your Honor, can we sentence this person essentially to go to this program and essentially divert them from the system and prevent the decompensation? So I know there's much more that Jerry has to cover in terms of the programs and where we exist today. But what I'd like to leave everybody with is our partnership with California Forward and the jail utilization study is still probably the most prolific document that we use in terms of balancing where we're at and where we need to be. And the hardest thing we've done is really the part that Kevin showed us. Kevin left us with the algorithm, if you will, the path to be able to do this type of analysis. What we're having a hard time doing, and I talked about law and justice, we've come up with the money to get an analyst and be able to digest this information. But those analysts are such a hot commodity, we don't seem to keep them very long because we're doing all these innovative things and other people want to hire them. So getting to the point where we can say, here's where we were and where we're going has been difficult for us. But I can tell you that 2 significant programs have come out of that. They're all related with faith-based partnerships and community-based partnerships. And we're starting to introduce, when you're talking about your vulnerable populations, actually addressing trauma as part of our process, both in the facility and out. With that, I'll turn it over to Jerry so he can give you some more specifics in the comparison to not only San Bernardino County, but of course his experiences in Riverside.
Well, good morning, everyone. Yes, no, I had a wonderful opportunity to work with Cal Forward when I was with Riverside County as well now with San Bernardino. I formerly served as assistant sheriff responsible for the corrections division for Riverside County, and I'm a corrections professional. So this is my profession that I've seen my entire adult life. We went through the logic of how the data was analyzed and the challenges that come with that. Most jail systems in California, including ours here as well as in Riverside at the time, are old, inadequate systems that are, for the tech people on the call, flat files where you can't grab data and analyze it. So Kevin was able to really dig deep in a 5-year aggregate and look at the different, primarily length of stay, who's coming in and that sort of thing. But when you look at it, much of the things that were discovered during that review were known, but we really couldn't quantify at the time. The jail systems, when you look at all of the challenges that face many of us in California, whether it be jail system or outside the jail system, is one word, and that's capacity. There's not enough capacity in jail systems. There's not enough capacity in the mental hospitals, and there's not enough capacity for mental health treatment in the community. And that is why the jails become a recipient of a lot of the mental health treatment. Now, historically, through the years, many jail systems do a wonderful job of identifying who's severely mentally ill in a jail, and normally do a wonderful job of corralling these folks and getting them seen by psychiatrists. But there's no real end game planned out with mental health treatment. And that is the huge benefit that we received in working with Cal Forward, both in Riverside and San Bernardino County, where we implemented a step-down model. We're basically providing therapeutic treatment and reentry in the community, which is a huge void and oftentimes in counties when treating the mentally ill. The main areas pushing for Cal Forward with the mentally ill, obviously, in San Bernardino County, we're doing a lot of wonderful things in treating the mentally ill. Not just those ones who are deemed incompetent to stand trial, but also the ones that just happen to be in custody and being treated and identified as seriously mentally ill. We do a lot of group therapy now in jail systems. We have individual therapy, and we work very closely with DBH for a reentry and a warm handoff in the community, which is huge because the recidivism rate of this population is rather large. The biggest benefit from the data and some of the work started soon after Cal Forward left and Riverside is developing a team that basically work together, representing the sheriff's office, the bench, the DA, public defender, probation, parole, and the like, and doing an analysis on the most often booked person in a calendar year. And what you find, and what Kevin alluded to earlier, is most often than not, most of these folks are being booked in very frequently for drug issues or alcohol issues under the influence. You'd have some of the data, and you look at it, the top ones normally will come up with a person who's booked in for drunk in public 50 times in a year, 70 times in a year. So what this team can do is on the community aspect, and also I forgot to mention homeless teams involved in this group, where we can engage some of these folks in the community, identify them while they're in the jail system, start to provide resources to them, do evidence-based assessments on them for therapeutic treatment, and then continuing that in the community with the hopes of keeping them from coming back to jail and providing them the necessary care that they desire or need. Not necessarily know that they desire it at that point. It takes some time with some of these folks, especially if they're homeless. That is the key with that. Focusing one chunk at a time, 5 at a time. I have some wonderful success stories. There was one gentleman who was homeless in Riverside County. We engaged him maybe 15, 20 times. And finally, the last time, he took us up and got him into an alcohol treatment program. Well, as soon as he got in the program, all of a sudden he had a warrant. Well, the DA and public defender on the team worked with the judge on the team, and we took care of that warrant and allowed him to continue the program and not have to leave for the warrant. These are examples of partnerships that they can work together and really make an impact. Now, mind you, we're not going to change a lot, but if you can change a handful out of 50, that's generations of families possibly down the road, and we change lives, and that's a huge benefit with that. The other thing, like I said, is the mental health, and that we're really trying to focus treating the mentally ill. On a personal note, I've always been a huge advocate for treating the mentally ill, so it's a passion for me. I firmly believe there's a lot of folks in jail systems that probably, if they were treated, getting effective treatment and medications, they may not even be in custody to begin with. But that's a whole other issue that's way above the county level. That's more of a state level looking at issues for that. that is one area we looked at, and we're making great strides in San Bernardino County treating the mentally ill. I'm very proud of that. I know the sheriff's very proud of it. His leadership and Shannon's leadership has helped continue that to grow. The other areas and ideas we took off with Cal Forward is running a report of people in custody for 3 years or more unsentenced. It doesn't take much work to do. Regenerate that report monthly, provide it to the presiding judge to give to the bench, as well as the DA and the public defender. And it's an easy document that they could use to find out, okay, is there a correlation over certain folks always in custody so long? It could be a lot of continuances, which, Kevin, you're very familiar with that. You were on a strike team, Riverside County, to help fix that many, many years ago. Those challenges still exist. The other is looking at people booked in maybe just on technical violations for probation. If we booked the guy 14 times for technical violation, maybe incarceration is not working. Maybe we need to look at something else. Those are small things that have really helped from the Cal Forward. The biggest challenge, though, and I'm sure after with us in San Bernardino as well in Riverside, after these reports are done, Prop 47 took effect, and these reports that are out there don't really reflect Prop 47. It goes back to that one word again, capacity. So we do a legislative change, we do decriminalize some drug crimes as well as property. And what ends up happening is, you saw this very much throughout California, jail bookings and capacity drop 15 to 17% for a period of time. And then guess where that vacuum get filled with? They got filled in with the same individuals getting court remanded because they're not showing up to court. And so you still have this recurring process of people may be cited in the field for drug possession, for theft. They're getting booked in through the term that Kevin and Scott talk as a side door, which is through the court system as opposed to off the street. And you create this perpetual wheel, unfortunately. And that is because the capacity didn't match in the community to address that before the law was implemented. So those are challenges that we'll continue to have. We continue to be aggressive in doing assessments on individuals for alcohol abuse, drug abuse, developing this process to identify people who are repeatedly booked in to try to reach them in the community, which makes it very advantageous for counties to do that because they're not in custody anymore, so they qualify for Medicare. So that's a huge benefit for trying to engage these people in the community, and then providing the treatment within the jail system. Those are where a lot of bookings are coming from and the challenges. I wish there was more capacity in the community for the mentally ill. I think that would really help. It's a challenge to treat these people in the jails. It's not ideal, but we definitely do the best job we possibly can in a jail. So those are the main things identified with Cal Forward and the comparisons to counties. Some of the slides there, we talked about some of the booking disparities between San Bernardino and Riverside County, and that also goes to capacity. San Bernardino County's bed capacity is 3,900 beds for 2.1 million residents. So you have a lot of agencies that don't necessarily would book in more frequently as in Riverside, in San Bernardino, where we have over 7,000 beds. So it goes from past behavior that's learned through the years. But a lot of it in the end, when you circle back on any of these challenges, it becomes a capacity, either in the mental hospitals in the state, mental health treatment in the community, or jail beds in capacity in the jails. Those all come back to that one word and the challenge that exists.
Hey, Jerry, if I could just capitalize on one thing that I think everybody needs to know. Realistically, we're talking about the betterment of human beings.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is a business. And when we look at the business side of that, one other thing that California Forward showed us is the amount of jail beds we're using in a manner that really isn't efficient. And we could use them in a much better capacity. And I know there's a number of folks from some of these innovative programs we have, but we involved our county finance people in the California Forward study and let them see it. They took it a completely different direction, started doing their own analysis. And I have a very innovative lieutenant that currently works in our inmate welfare group right now. And he did a high utilizer study. Well, at the same time, the county has also done a high utilizer study. Well, the county noticed that homelessness, again, that vulnerable population, popped up. And if we were doing a better job at that, potentially could reduce the load on the jail. What Lieutenant Porter found with his group, and that's FACE, is if we implement FACE and do more of a hand-holding type of process, starting in the facility all the way through getting them out for their first 30 days, that we could do a much better job about keeping these folks out of the system. Then if you take our high desert, I mean, San Bernardino County is the largest county in the United States. Up in the Victorville area, we had a problem, and this is how you can use something like the jail utilization study practically. We were taking people to the bus station in downtown Victorville when they got released. A lot of those people would remain there homeless, affecting the downtown businesses and a number of things. We partnered with one of our local faith-based organizations up there and did a pilot program. And during that pilot program, we realized if we actually throw general fund monies in the direction of these folks and are able to keep them out of jail, we're actually saving more money by the use of less jail bed days. And I'll give you an example. One of our top 11 highest utilizers of the jail was coming to the jail about 2 times a month in terms of booking, sometimes 4 to 6 times in 1 month. That person got involved with New Hope up in our high desert area, and that person was able to stay out of jail for 6 months. So just imagine what you can establish a dollar value to that when a person's getting booked in 6 times in a month versus being able to stay out for 6 months at a time. The other thing is by using the jail utilization study, where in the world do you find that support to be able to go to the finance folks in the county and say, look, this is where we should be investing our money. This is why it's important to invest your money in this population and to get that overall buy-in. So when I talk about the law and justice team, now you're actually involving finance people who, as a county, we all get the bigger picture and globally are trying to do better things for our residents. And you know, if we're fixing these people, we're also fixing the things Jerry alluded to earlier, and that's all this quality of life crime that really affects when you go to the store and what you're seeing in the world in terms of homelessness and things of that nature. We're very excited for New Hope to continue going. It also allows us as an agency to be agile. And what I mean by that is a lot of grants are tied to some of these things we talk about. But when you get involved in a grant, you're partnered with those folks for maybe 3 years because that's the grant requirement. We're able to go after efficiency and performance by going at this in a completely different way in terms of allocating funds to this. So if we're partnered with a partner that's not performing, we immediately can shift gears and go out and partner with another partner. We're very excited to start off with our new FACE program. That's going to be a completely different component that I talked about earlier as far as dealing with the trauma someone may have existed, involving them with their families, just a number of things we're very excited to do. And I hope the next time we get on a conversation with California Forward, we're actually going to be able to give significant statistics that we've made an in-run into this population and are doing positive things for people.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks all of you for being here and presenting on this important topic. My name is David Loaiza, and I'm part of the California Forward team, and I'll be moderating the next part of this webinar, which will be a question and answer. So in the next 20 minutes, we hope, or 15 minutes, we hope to get through as many questions as we can. So to all the audience, please submit your questions using the question and answer button, and share your name and organization so that we can introduce you when we ask the question. To get us started, we have a question from Juan Preciado from the San Bernardino County Probation Department, and this is a 2-part question for Kevin, and I'll boot it up so that y'all can see it also. He asks, is there a particular reason side door categories were grouped in that way? As warrants are the largest percentage, shouldn't that category be a standalone category?
Can you re-ask the question? What are the types, or what was just to make sure I understand?
Yes, one more time. He asked, is there a particular reason side door categories were grouped in that way in your presentation?
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the idea was that, we think because there's a different kind of court process involved with people that are coming through for new crimes versus things that we thought were not necessarily involved, I call it a fresh arrest, a pickup. Every county kind of calls it something different. there's a different kind of set of court practices to go with that. And so the reason we kind of group things like warrants, court remands, which is a remand to custody, maybe somebody who's been out in the community, kind of on maybe a pretrial status and getting booked back in, and then things like warrants and like probation or parole violations, because those don't always come with a new crime attached to it. And that's a little bit different than somebody with a new crime, and the court process is different. So the reason we group them together is because they basically have different partners involved, and there's also a different kind of set of kind of court processes, and I think the opportunities are different. And it kind of goes to the heart of like making sure that we're kind of looking at the jail population. We can really kind of isolate, how do we kind of know like what the right policy lever is to pull, and not just treat it as, with San Bernardino County as an example, 4,000, 4,500 people, they're all there for different reasons. How do we make sure we can get really specific to create either good programs or good policy differences? But that's the reason why.
Thanks. And to follow up on the second part of that question, and I'm putting it up here, with the data set for side door bookings in the San Bernardino County be available for further review and analysis?
I think the report is public. I think it's been published in different places. But I think the data itself, I think, was protected information because it includes both a lot of mental health information as well as more detailed, like kind of like people identifiers. But I think the report itself, I think, is a public document or was definitely released in some way. But I defer to Shannon and Jerry about the. Yeah, I know it's been a few years.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah. It is a public document. It has been published, and any of our partners in San Bernardino County will be more than happy to share that document with them, and they can just certainly just ask us for it, and we'll make sure they get a full copy of the jail utilization report. And I know that is a great question by probation. They're great partners. They've done some things as a result of the jail utilization study, and just a quick example is in knowing that some of the folks we could make differences with only spend less than 30 days with us, the probation department actually opened their day reporting centers that they don't have to this population, so that they could finish a GED with one of our partners, which is a 5 Keys charter school. So that's just an example of you have practical things where you work with your law and justice partners for the betterment of this population to keep them out of custody.
And I'll just have real quickly, one thing that that we see nationally is that probation populations are often in jail, not for new crimes, but for breaking rules of probation. Yeah. And so that is fertile ground for looking at, are there alternatives to that we can look at? Do we really want to use precious jail resources and bed space for people breaking rules of probation? Or are there other forms of sort of accountability and engagement that can be applied? So I think the second part of that question, which was a really good one, is that we intended this data all along to be something that would be a starting point, and that you would dig into the data to find out, well, why is that going on, and what are the opportunities to change that outcome?
Yeah, and the only other thing I'll add there, I think that was kind of the vision of this too, is like we don't always know where the data will take you, and Scott and I have no shortage of ideas, but I think there's also sometimes this push to have 150 recommendations that nobody's going to be able to follow. So we kind of try to stick to things that were kind of broad observations that were borne out by the collaborative input we got when looking at this. And then to Scott's point about being a beefy report, I would say it's mostly appendices because we didn't know how people would want to use it. Like, we don't know if is gender the issue, is race, ethnicity the issue, is the geography the issue? And I think we just want to make sure this is a resource to the community, but also to make sure people had a full understanding of what's in there, to use it in ways that are innovative for their own county, well beyond anything we could ever create on our own, because Scott and I have limits too. We don't have, but people that are in the community have the most to gain from knowing this and creating those good connections. And I think, the different programs that both Jerry and Shannon had mentioned are kind of outcroppings of that. Even like things like whole person care was a way to kind of actually put some numbers around who's using lots of systems in these counties as well, by kind of knowing who's in the jail and why, because that's the thing well beyond our program. But then if that data is out there in the community, it can be used for lots of things. So it's kind of an open data kind of way to kind of look at an appendix of it and then use it in ways that works for everybody, hopefully over the long term.
Thank you. We also have two questions that are regarding AB 1950 from Laura Martinez from the San Bernardino Superior Court, and Lillian Rossetti from SLO County Behavioral Health, who's a clinician and focuses on jail treatment services. The question is, given deferments, AB 1950 and AB 109, what are these counties doing to populate their drug courts? And also, a second part of this question is who gets booked and who stays?
Okay, I'll take a portion of that, and I'll start with the latter, who gets booked and who stays. A lot of that has to do, we have an internal group that actually looks at these things. So if you're a low-level crime, there's probably a high likelihood you're going to be released on a citation with a court date. Talking low-level drug crimes, low-level property crimes, and things of that nature. It also depends on the higher level folks that we're housing at that period of time and the available bed space we have. And then most recently, COVID has affected us in a way, and we've had to make a number of changes that I'm sure Jerry can tell you about. But really, because we are a large jail system, and when I say working with our partners in the jail utilization study, it's even letting your local chiefs of police know what's going on in your jail. And they've worked with us to divert a lot of these lower level folks so we didn't have exposures and a number of things. So we do the evaluation on who stays and who goes very early on. And we have a whole set of criteria that we're more than happy to share with folks in terms of how we do that. And I know some other systems actually use computer systems and different algorithms to do the same thing that we're doing. And ours is in agreement with our local court system. As far as deferrals for mental health, a lot of that is occurring in our county early on at the DA and public defenders positions. And when they are unable to defer, then certainly they come into our return to competency program, jail-based competency programs. And we do what we can do to shorten their turnaround time and keep them from decompensating.
I'll speak really quickly to AB 1950, which, as a former probation officer for 30 years, I have some thoughts on that. And just briefly, that is the bill that shortened the length of probation. And theoretically, that could lead to lower caseloads. And I think it presents a good opportunity. And the data that we see around the side doors on violations leading to jail, a good opportunity to have a discussion about what is the purpose of probation. And theoretically, the lower caseloads could give probation an opportunity to have a more meaningful intervention and to better engage folks so that probation functions as it was originally intended to do nearly 200 years ago by John Augustus, to really be an alternative to jail rather than a pathway to jail. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with AB 1950 to revisit the purpose and practice of probation.
Thank you. We have another question from Chelsea Acevedo. I believe she's one of our young leaders in the advisory council. And she asked, regarding the data shown for racial disparities as people progress through the system, are those trends similar for minority youth who enter the juvenile justice system?
I could maybe take a stab at that. Can you repeat the last part of that question? Is it consistent with what we see in the juvenile system? Is that what I heard?
Correct. Are those trends similar for minority youth who enter the juvenile justice system?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Across the country, we see in particular Black youth are often 5 times overrepresented in the juvenile system, as are Latino youth, who are Latinx youth tend to be also undercounted. So that's another factor. And that varies from county to county. I would say, 20 years ago, we saw the overrepresentation even far more significant of Latino youth. Maybe that had to do with the focus of gang issues and the sort of overreach that sometimes occurred with that population. But yes, we see the disparities, and we see the deeper you get into the system, the more significant those disparities are. Overrepresentation of them.
To Chelsea's question, just for sheriff's departments, and I think what she's asking is really critical, and I don't want to share with the group. A lot of legislation is going on what I call the front end and the arrest end in terms of how these things are happening, how they're being tracked, racial disparities, and a number of those things that the dust hasn't even settled on. A lot of the reform that's currently occurring in the law enforcement profession now. But in terms of sheriff's departments, where we can probably affect equity the best is this using data like the jail utilization study, and on the back end with these programs like FACE and like HOPE, because if you just think about it, and it's using a wide brush, of course, if minorities are being introduced into the system at a disproportionate rate, they're coming out at a disproportionate rate. And if we can start affecting their lives positively by introducing these programs and getting them connected to services, we can make the biggest impact as it relates to equity when we look at it through the lens of the jail utilization study.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from Chelsea. She asks, how does poverty or social economic status contribute to your study?
Kevin, you want?
I think for our, yeah, I think for ours, we kind of really focused on kind of like probably a little like, you know, kind of the justice system per se, knowing that, you know, things that are more health and human services, behavioral health, kind of, I would call it like social determinants in a lot of ways, are sometimes kind of harder to divine. And actually from just like who comes into the jail or jail booking record isn't the right place to kind of look at that. But how do you look kind of upstream and make sure you're engaging partners like employment, economic development, employment, education, all those things we know will kind of help kind of improve some of those, I think maybe kind of some of the financial issues people have, as well as things like homeless services and homeless connections as well. So I think our idea here was actually more to kind of show this is what's happening currently, but then how do lots of different organizations, agencies, people actually take this and kind of then say, what creativity can we bring? What more could we do as a community? What resources do we have or do we need to actually have an impact in our community with people kind of in a more of a prevention way, not just once they kind of enter this system. And the idea was to kind of use this study to kind of lay out kind of where folks are hitting the system, but then have the community kind of decide how do we kind of work upstream from that, as well as just, you know, other government agencies also looking at the community as well. And I think Shannon mentioned the faith-based organizations that came out of this as well. How do you kind of look at a lot of these different community aspects to address some of these things beyond just what the justice system can and can't do or should do?
Yeah, and as we look into things like the side door issues, and you might then dig into that, why are people getting high rates of warrants? For sometimes we find that it's associated with fines and fees. We've heard probationers say, I'm not showing up to probation because I don't have my, you know, whatever it is, $25, you know, client fee that I'm supposed to pay every month. So these things do tend to impact the system. Issues of sort of poverty, race, and geography all play a part. And this data is a starting point to help dig into some of those issues.
Thank you. And perhaps we have time for one more question. And this is a question from Lilian Rossetti again. Her question is, what are these counties doing to incentivize behavioral change?
Well, I think that kind of goes back to the challenge that we have based on the system that's in place. We're trying to get these folks, encouraging them to get in the programs. We're engaging them in the community by identifying them on the most frequently booked individual. But the challenge remains the same, is that on a lot of these folks, these crime violations are rather minor now. They're nothing more than a parking ticket. But the problem, they go to court or they finally get arrested with 14 or more or 15 warrants, they get stuck in the system anyway. Or if they happen to be picked up and they go to the courts, the judge remands them into custody, and they remain in the jail system. They take up precious jail beds. So I think this is a proven example too, where sometimes you can't just throw money at a problem. There has to be a lot of communication involved in getting the parties together, identify a good game plan, and attack it as a team. So the incentive remains challenging still, but it's not impossible. You know, it takes the DVHs in the county, work closely with the sheriff's office, work closely with the county, work closely with law enforcement partners, and targeting creative ideas. And like the undersheriff made mention, a program that we're going to start here really soon, or actually we already have it, but we're adding a lot more to it, is really digging deeper into the reentry component, which lacks a lot in counties in California, of having a strong reentry. And so we're going to keep trying, but it's not a simple answer.
We're fortunate in this county, we have a great reentry collaborative, and I know California Forward worked with that collaborative as well. So it really was an alignment of time and what was going on in the state of California that really allowed us to be successful and to meet each other at a time we were all needed to make some of the progress we've talked about today.
Scott, Kevin, Shannon, Jerry, thank you for your presentation and helping us explore how we can improve the justice system for the benefit of our communities across the state. Thank you again for this time, and thank you to every single one of you who's listening and tuning in. We value your participation and your feedback. And just like today, next week, we'll be bringing you another rich discussion titled Regions Build Together. If you have not already done so, please register. You won't want to miss it. And thank you everybody for sharing this space with us.
Thank you, folks.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks, everybody.